Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Charlene and this is Coffee and a Book. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you all of the books that I read in the month of April. I read from a wide variety of genres, so I'm just going to share the books in the order that I read them. And for each book, I'm going to be sharing a short synopsis, my thoughts on the book, and a bit of content information. The content is mostly going to be based on the type of information you would get if you were to look at a movie rating or a video game rating. So I'm going to go over things like language, drug and alcohol content, sexual content, violence, and if applicable, themes. This will probably make more sense once I get a bit more into it, so let's just go ahead and get started. So the first book that I finished in the month of April was Moby Dick by Herman Melville. This is an adult classic, and it's a pretty well-known book, even by people who haven't read it, as being a revenge story. This book is told from the perspective of Ishmael, who takes a job on a whaling ship captained by a man named Ahab, only to learn weeks after they've left port that the captain has a vendetta against a white whale known as Moby Dick. The whale took his leg, and now Ahab wants to see him dead, no matter the cost. My personal experience with this book was a roller coaster. I actually started this book in July of 2023. I got about 40 chapters in, really enjoyed the beginning, was struggling a bit after they boarded the Pequod, which is the ship that Ahab captains, and put the book down. I had tried physical book, I had tried audiobook. Neither one was really working. I picked it back up again in March of this year. I started with the audiobook and it was going okay, but I still found myself zoning out, not really paying attention, not really interested. I decided to try reading the book physically. That didn't work because Herman Melville's language is very over the top, in my opinion. He writes very long, very complicated sentences that can be hard to follow. And I felt like I needed the audiobook in order to understand what he was saying, but I needed the physical book to hold my attention. So I ended up doing both. I listened to the audiobook while reading the physical book. And not long after that, my interest peaked with this book. I ended up enjoying this so much. Far more than I expected to. There were still parts of the book that were kind of slow for me. I wasn't quite as interested in what he had to share in the book, mostly with the whaling and some things about the whales. But even some of that was interesting as well. And a lot of people talk about a chapter on the color white, which is in this book. That was actually one of the most interesting chapters to me, but more from, I guess, a philosophical or even literary perspective than just story perspective. As far as the story, it halted the story, but it was a really interesting chapter with the ideas that he explored in that chapter. However, I will say this much, Captain Ahab is a jerk. And I know he's obsessed with the whale. I knew that before we went into the story. He wants to kill this whale no matter what it cost him or anybody else. However, there are two particular moments late in the book where you really see to what extent he is willing to go in both being a whaler and in hunting Moby Dick, that just paint him as one of the most awful people. And if you've read this book and you're curious to know what chapters I'm talking about, or if you don't have an interest in reading the book, the specific chapters are chapter 128, titled The Pequod Meets the Rachel, and chapter 132, entitled The Symphony. Specifically in that one, his conversation with Starbuck. I won't say any more than that to leave out spoilers. But honestly, the part that did it for me the most was the ending. The ending absolutely gutted me. And I still find myself thinking about it. I finished this in early April. It's now early May, and I'm still thinking about it. So it's not a 5-star book because there were parts of it that I wasn't as interested in. I didn't love it the whole way through, but it is one that has stuck with me. Now, as far as the content for the book, I'm going to have to read these off of my phone, so forgive me. As far as language, there was quite a bit throughout, sprinkled in throughout, though it is mostly D and H words. For drugs and alcohol, there is a mention of a man being an alcoholic in his past, and there were a few, not a lot, but a few mentions of men drinking or potentially being drunk. It's not in graphic detail, but it is in there. As far as sexual content, there are mentions of two men sharing a bed in an inn, and normally I wouldn't mention it, but there are references to them being like a married couple and things like that. Also, several mentions of spermaceti coming from the whale, but in the shortened form, which we all know has a double meaning and can sometimes feel like he's playing on the double meaning. And there is quite a bit of violence, mostly men towards whales or whales towards men. The next book that I finished in the month of April was The Lost Queen by Signe Pike. This is the first book in the Lost Queen trilogy, and it is an adult historical fiction, though you could potentially classify it as adult historical fantasy. A historical reimagining of the people who may have inspired the legends and stories of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, this story takes place in southern Scotland in the 6th century, following Langorith, a queen of Scotland lost to history, and her twin brother Lilican, the man who would inspire the stories of Merlin. Langorith wants to be a wisdom keeper like her mother, but as the only daughter of a Scottish king, her destiny is to marry a noble or royal instead. Torn between two religions and two men, can she achieve the future she desires? There were a lot of things I really enjoyed about this book. I love the writing, the characters, the setting. It's very immersive, very vivid, and you really feel like you're there. However, there were a couple of things I didn't enjoy quite as much. The first one is the narration choice. The book is written in first person, but the narration style does not change throughout the book, even though Langorith goes from being 10 years old at the beginning of the book to 30-something years old by the end of the book. So there are a lot of parts in this book where, mostly in parts 1 and 2, where she's 10 and 16 years old respectively, that the narration sounds much more mature than her character actually is. And she does have a tendency to be very quick to act without really thinking things through. She tends to be more hot-headed, which was another issue I had, because putting that together with the narration style, it doesn't fit. The narration sounds very grown up, very mature, but then she doesn't act it until part 3 when she's in her 30s. At that point, the narration and her actions actually match up. But in the early parts of the book, they really don't. And it feels very jarring to have this grown-up, mature narration by a child who doesn't act like that. So I guess my biggest issue is probably more the narration style, because if the narration had matched up with the maturity and the mentality of Langorith at the younger ages, I don't think her actions would have bothered me as much, because it would have felt in line with what we were getting in the writing style. But since it didn't match up, it was even more jarring that she acts this way. And almost in a way either made the narration feel out of character or Langorith's actions feel out of character. Other than that, it was a really good story, and I'm hoping with the later books in the series that with Langorith being older, the narration style will match her age and her maturity, and it won't feel like such a big deal. As for the content on this book, the first category is language, and there was some language throughout the book. I know there was one C word in it, and there were a few others throughout, though I'm pretty sure they were mostly D words. Drug and alcohol content-wise, there are many mentions of people drinking and or getting drunk, including the main character when she's about 14 to 16 years old, which was probably the norm at the time. I mean, I know even today in the UK, the drinking age is lower than it is here in the US. So, and in Europe, I think it's even lower. So it probably wouldn't seem so weird to someone from the UK or Europe to read that a 14 or 16-year-old is drinking wine or possibly getting a little bit drunk. But it does to us in the States because the drinking age is so much higher. As far as sexual content, there are two fairly graphic sex scenes in the book. The second one more than the first. There is one scene in which a woman sees men and prostitutes in various states of undress. And there is also a scene in which it is implied that, it's not stated outright, but it is strongly implied that women and girls were victims of SA. Then as far as violence, there is a fair amount in the book. In the time in which the book takes place, this area is getting very close to going to war with the Anglo-Saxons. So you have different instances of battles and wars going on. And most of the time, it's more so that we see the aftermath of those attacks. But there are a couple of times when we see things as they're going on and as they're happening. So those two books that I finished early in the month were fairly long books. And after that, I just kind of needed a break. So I ended up picking up a lot of shorter books that are easier to get through, things like that. So that kind of explains the direction my reading went for the rest of the month. And the next book that I finished was Full Metal Alchemist Volume 6. This is a 3-volume bind-up, but I read Volumes 4 and 5 last year and for some reason just never got to Volume 6. So I decided to read it in the month of April. This series follows two brothers, Edward and Alphonse Elric, who attempted a human transmutation with disastrous results. Ed lost an arm and a leg, and Al, well, lost his whole body. His soul now lives inside a metal suit, while Ed has a metal arm and leg. Ed is a state alchemist, meaning he works for the military, but all he and his brother want to do is find a way to get their bodies back. And their mother. I'm going to try to turn this to where there's no glare for you guys, but unfortunately it's a shiny cover. So that synopsis kind of tells you what the entire series is about. Volume 6 in particular, sorry, that glare is awful. Volume 6 in particular is all backstory. It chronicles from the time the boys are first learning alchemy up until Ed is offered a job as a state alchemist and ultimately accepts. So there's nothing new in this volume that continues the story that's happened in the first 5 volumes. So unfortunately, I don't really have a whole lot to say about it. It was nice getting the backstory, but there's not enough there for me to talk about what I liked or didn't like about the volume. For the content in this book, as far as language, there is some, or actually I wrote down there's a fair amount, mostly, if not all, D words. As far as drug and alcohol content, there is none. Sexual content, there is one scene where women are dressed provocatively. This is a manga, so there's pictures in here. Violence, there's a lot in the beginning, and there is some throughout the rest of the volume as well. This manga does tend to be more violent, so this is pretty much on par with the rest of the volumes. And then I did go ahead and include themes here, because there are some things that happen in this book that don't really fit into one of the other categories, but I do feel like they should be mentioned. So there are mentions of miscarriage. Obviously, as I said in the synopsis of the book, or synopsis of the series, loss of part or all of one's body due to human transmutation, alchemy, and there are some scary images, particularly to do with the human transmutation and how wrong it all went. The next book that I finished in the month of April was Reaper Man by Terry Pratchett. This is book 2 in the Death series that's part of Discworld. I don't remember what number it is in the Discworld series. And this is an adult absurdist fantasy. What happens when Death finds out he's going to die? After receiving a notice that his life, so to speak, is coming to an end, he decides to go out into the world and live out what little time he has left, finding a job and trying to see what it means to be a living person. But with death absent and no one currently taking over his duties, things in the living world begin going awry. So my camera battery died, and then apparently I started recording without hitting the record button. So I've already gone over the rest of this entire video and realized I didn't hit record. So I'm sorry if I seem tired. But yeah, apparently I'm having issues with recording. So let's just get back to Reaper Man. So if you saw my rapid fire wrap up, which was the first video I put out on this channel, then you will know that I did not like Mort, which was the first book in the Death series. And if you're surprised that I continued on with Reaper Man after not liking that book, the reason is that, I should say, the main reason is that my brother, sister-in-law, and I started our own, I would call it an in real life book club because they live 5-6 hours away from me. We don't meet in person. But we started our own book club, and we each take turns picking a book every month for the three of us to read together. And my sister-in-law is having us read all of the Death books this year, at least through Hogfather. So I knew I was going to be continuing on with this book. And after Mort, I was a little bit nervous to continue on. But this book was a complete 180 for me. I enjoyed this book so much. I enjoyed the humor. I enjoyed the story. I enjoyed the characters. This was just a fun book. And I'm so glad I continued on with the series and didn't give up after Mort. The only thing in this book I probably didn't care for was the philosophical and or religious commentary in the book. Terry Pratchett, I'm fairly certain, was an atheist. And so that bleeds into this book at times, or really all of the Discworld books at times. So it's not surprising that there are things in the book that I don't agree with as a Christian. But aside from that, the book was just a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed my time with it. As far as the content of the book, for language, there are several swear words throughout the book, mostly D words, some S words, and A words. At least one B word that's cut off in the middle, and an F word that is implied. For drugs and alcohol, there are 1 or 2 mentions of people drinking. Sexual content, again, there's an F word that's implied, and it is in a sexual context. For violence, there are people being attacked by things you wouldn't expect people to be attacked by. And that's all I'm going to say about that. And then I'm also including themes for this one because, again, they don't fit into any of the other 4 categories, but I feel like they should be mentioned. So there are instances of mediums or divination or calling up spirits. As I kind of said earlier, there are atheistic and or there's also an all religions are fine viewpoint. And also undead and supernatural beings such as zombies, werewolves, vampires, boogeymen, etc. And then the next book that I picked up in the month of April was Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine. I read this book back when I was in college for the first time, so not even when I was a child. My friend and roommate at the time was surprised that I had never read this book, so she loaned it to me so I could read it, and I remembered really enjoying it. But there are 2 other books in the series, and I had considered reading them at one point, but it's been 15 years or so since I read this book. So there's just a lot that I didn't remember, and I didn't feel comfortable continuing the series without rereading this one. So I decided to reread it and go from there. In this book, Ella is a 15-year-old girl cursed with the gift of obedience from birth. Anything anyone tells her to do, she has to do it. After her mother dies, it seems her chance at finding out who put the curse on her, the only person who is able to remove it, is gone. But then her fairy godmother reveals the name of the fairy, and Ella finds herself on a quest to find her and hopefully get rid of this curse for good. Otherwise, how can she ever marry and get through life if others can always control her? I don't have a whole lot of thoughts on this book simply because it was a reread. There was a lot I didn't remember, but there was quite a bit that I did. And about the only thing I can really say is that I was originally planning to continue on with the series after I reread this, but now that I've read it, I realize I'm kind of past the point of wanting to read more books in the series or even more books like this, to be honest. If I had read them around the time I read this book, I probably would have enjoyed them. But I think these would be books that would be more fun for me to read if I was reading to my kids, not reading them for myself. So at this point, I have no intentions in continuing on with the series. But it is a really good book and a really good story, especially for middle grade kids. So I would still recommend it, but I'm not going to continue on with the series. Ooh, sorry, this is a reflective cover too, isn't it? So content-wise, as far as language, there isn't any. For drugs and alcohol, there are a few mentions of drinking wine. Sexual content, there are some kisses at the end of the book. Violence, there is some violence, mostly in ogres trying to eat people and other creatures. And then I do have one for themes, and that is abuse through forced obedience. As I said in the description, Ella is cursed with the gift of obedience. She has to obey any command given to her. And some people who know that about her use that to their advantage. All right, the next book that I read was Imbalance by Erin Faith Hicks, which is the 6th book in the Avatar: The Last Airbender graphic novel series. And there are other graphic novels that follow the characters from Avatar: The Last Airbender, but they are not considered part of the main series. This is considered to be the final book of the 6 in the series. So this series takes place after the events of the TV show. So if you haven't read the TV show, don't read these books. But for the most part, volumes 1 and 2 go together and form one story. Volumes 3 and 6 go together to form one story, or at least a continuation of the story. And 4 and 5 kind of stand on their own. It's mostly a series in that the events of each book follow one right after the other, but not that they tell one full cohesive story altogether. As the gang returns to the scene of the events from Volume 3, The Rift, they find that things have changed a lot more than they would have expected in such a short amount of time. And the changes are pitting benders and non-benders against each other. Can the gang find a peaceful way of resolving their problems before things blow sky high? So I'm not going to go into any details as far as this book or the previous books in the series, since I've never talked about any of them on here, though that's mostly because I didn't have a channel at the time that I read them. It was a good book. Unfortunately, it's not one of my favorites, and it didn't really wrap up the series. And apparently I forgot to list the content for this book, so I have to remember off the top of my head. Language-wise, there isn't any. Pretty sure there's none in any of the books. Drugs and alcohol, I don't recall there being any. Sexual content, there might be 1 or 2 kisses, and that's about it. Violence-wise, there is a fair amount. There are some explosions that happen. The blowing sky high was not just a figure of speech. And there are various times in the book where different groups of people are attacking each other. So there is some violence in the book as well. All right, and the last book that I finished in the month of April, and yes, we are still recording, I double checked, was Counting the Cost by Jill Duggar, which is a nonfiction memoir. And if you're not familiar with Jill Duggar, I'll give you a real quick rundown. Jill Duggar grew up before the eyes of America and the rest of the world on the show 19 Kids and Counting. But what was life really like behind the scenes? In Counting the Cost, Jill explains what life was like in the Duggar household, from before the TV show deal to after she left the show for good. But getting away from the show wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was getting distance from her family and undoing a lot of hurt and brainwashing from her time growing up in a home influenced by the IBLP organization. So before I talk about the book itself, I want to preface this with, I personally never watched the show 19 Kids and Counting. Part of the time I wasn't interested in the show, and part of the time, even if I had been, we didn't pay for cable or satellite, so I didn't have access to it. I don't know how much that affected my enjoyment of the book, but I did not have any preconceived biases against any particular people or in favor of any particular people in the family prior to going into the book. I think a reason I wasn't interested in the show is because I had a friend and roommate who watched the show Jon and Kate Plus 8 fairly regularly, and I saw how all of that went down. So I kind of just wasn't interested. However, after seeing Ginger Duggar, one of Jill's younger sisters, do an interview on a podcast, I started to get more interested in the family, especially after she talked about her family being influenced by the IBLP organization, which, if you don't know, stands for Institute of Basic Life Principles, and it was headed by a man named Bill Gothard, although if I understand correctly, he's in prison now, so probably not really heading the organization anymore. Ginger Duggar also put out a book, and I'll pop an image of it up here because I can't remember the title off the top of my head. But hers is more based on her faith journey of getting out of IBLP and getting into her Bible and finding her own faith. Whereas Jill Duggar's is more based on her life before the show, during the show, and after the show. Religion does play a little bit of a role in her book, but not as much as it sounds like it does in I can't talk, I'm sorry. In Ginger Duggar's book. I'm getting tongue-tied after all this talking. As far as Counting the Cost itself, I really enjoyed this book. I flew through it in about 2 or 3 days. I couldn't put it down. I was so curious to know what happened next. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed her perspective on everything and getting to read that. I also appreciated how she didn't have the mentality of, I'm just going to throw everybody under the bus who did something to me that I now don't agree with. She very much is extending grace to her family, to the people of TLC who were doing the show, and really just trying to look through the lens of everybody was trying to do their best for everybody else. Just sometimes their intentions came with not the best way of doing things or not the best way of handling things. And I have no idea how much my not watching the show affected my enjoyment of the book. Maybe I enjoyed it more because I didn't have any preconceived notions of who Jill Duggar was or what I thought of her or the rest of her family. But I just know that I did really enjoy the book. So even if you haven't watched the show, if you have an interest in a book like this, I would recommend picking it up. And then content-wise, language, there was none. Drugs and alcohol, there are a few mentions of drinking, but not drunkenness, from what I recall. Sexual contents, there are some mentions of girls having been sexually abused, which, if you know anything about the family, heard any of the news stories, you're probably aware of this already. But it is mentioned in there. There's no graphic detail, just the mention that it did happen. And also mentions of a man having pornography and child pornography on his computer. Violence, there's none, though under themes, I would list emotional abuse and manipulation. Again, mostly in the fact that IBLP is basically a cult. They use fear to... They have certain principles that people are supposed to live under. And it's the idea of if you live outside of these principles, then you live outside of God's protection. And so that fear keeps people within the organization and living the way the organization says they should. And anytime a group keeps people in their organization or in their group through fear and manipulation, it's a cult. So that is present at times in the book. All right, those are all the books I read in April. We are still recording. I feel like I'm going to be checking that every 2 minutes now when I film. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it all made sense. I feel like I'm getting tongue-tied because I've talked about some of these books twice now. If you've read any of the books I talked about today, feel free to let me know what you thought about them down in the comments below. Also, if you have any favorites from April, or if you've read any really good books in the beginning of May, because I realize this video is coming out late compared to most wrap-ups, let me know about those in the comments below as well. I have 3 other videos out on the channel at the time that this video goes live, so I will have them linked down in the description so you can go check them out if you haven't seen them already. And I will have 2 more videos coming out over the next 2 days that you can check out as well. And other than that, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in my next one.